Welcome back, everyone, to episode 2 of Afghan Beyond Conflict. This series will be running throughout the month of February on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 6 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. To receive notifications and updates regarding the series, please follow our social media platforms. And if you miss any of our episodes, please check them out on our YouTube channel. Today, we'll be in conversation with Dr Nafees Ur Rehman Durrani. Dr. Rehman is a German-based academic and researcher with experience of teaching at various Pakistani and German universities. He frequently writes on the history of Afghanistan and Pakistan with a focus on the Pashtun history of the region. He is a staunch advocate of bringing the two brotherly countries of Afghanistan and Pakistan closer and hopes that the youth of the two countries will be able to bridge the gaps for the good of the millions of people in both countries. Dr. Rehman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me on the show.
No, it's a pleasure. And as I said just before we started, this is going to be a history lesson for myself. So we're glad to have your expertise on board. Now, as we have begun this, with the series and the question that we ask every single one of our guests, what does it mean to be Afghan to you?
Okay, I think it's a quite easy question to ask and very difficult and complex to answer. As regards to any ethnicity that may be. And the reason is that from anthropological perspectives, from theoretical perspectives, there have been many studies, many analyses, and an ethnicity is always a multifaceted, multi-layered, a complex function, a process which is also dynamic in its nature, and it evolves over time. So there is never, I would say, not just that there are so many diverse opinions and analysis of the whole, what ethnicity is, be that Afghan or Punjabi or anything else for that matter. It depends that from what perspective we are looking at it. So being an Afghan, for example, for us, that means that are we talking about from the linguistic perspectives? Are we talking about from the national identity perspective? There is also quite a bit of religious identity also embedded within the Afghan identity itself. So to be called Afghan, that would mean one would have to identify with so many other concepts, bring in geography also to the equation. So it's not really an easy equation to conclude and to define what exactly Afghan would be. But a mix of many things. Language, geography, religion, the code of the Pashtun Wali. So this, a mix of all that defines one to be Afghan or Pashtun for that matter. Please go ahead.
No. Please, you were going to say something.
Because we started with what the Afghan concept of ethnicity itself is something that is subject to quite heated discussions and debates from the last, not just from the last few decades, but maybe even more than that. So we know that traditionally, Afghans have been synonymous with being Pashtuns. Pashtuns are the people who inhabit the northwest of Pakistan and part of the Afghan population. So they are traditionally they have been synonymous. Being Afghan and being Pashtuns would mean the same thing. But over the years, things have evolved, not for good, for worse, because of the nation states that came to be later on the geography, on the map of the world. What happened is post-Pakistan creation. This definition of Pashtun and Afghans being synonymous is somewhat now invalid. It's also something that happened on the Pakistani side, and this is something that also happened on the Afghan side. Being Afghan, I mean, like Afghanistan is quite a rich, diverse country, is Pakistan is also. And there are many other ethnicities other than Pashtuns or Afghans, for example, Tajik or Hazaras or many other people. And some of them, or I don't know if many of them, they do not like to be referred to as Afghan themselves, even though they identify and are proud of their country association, that they are from Afghanistan, but they do not want to be identified as Afghan, as traditionally, historically, Afghans have meant to be only Pashtuns. So they want to be distinctly referred to by their own ethnicity, Tajik or Hazara, things like that. On the Pakistani side, when Pakistan came into being, and then there was this political uh, struggle, unfortunate struggle that is still going on. Um, so what happened is that the Pashtuns on the Pakistani side, uh, also it came down from the state, and also many Pashtuns proudly identify themselves with the national identity of Pakistan itself. So now they don't want to be called Afghans, they only want to be called Pashtuns. And also, I mean, historically, what Afghan is something also not completely exactly clarified. So Afghans are meant to be many things. I mean, there are many unsettled debate where what is the origin of the word Afghan itself. But there has never been any confusion about being Pashtun, being of Pashtun ethnicity. So the Pakistani side of Pashtuns, they now, most of them, not all of them, I would say there are many people, myself included, that I'm proud of being of Afghan heritage. So I do not mind being called an Afghan. I actually love it and I'm proud of it. This is part of my heritage. But since on the Afghan side, even by their constitution, they refer to Arabs, Baloch, Tajik, and many other ethnicities. So, by the constitutional definition, anyone who is a citizen of Afghanistan is called an Afghan. So, they have also themselves taken away that ethnic relationship from the word itself. So, it has evolved over time. So now, yeah, for many people, being Afghan and being Pashtun still mean the same thing, which means we are actually referring to the group of people who speak Pashto language, who practice the Pashtun culture, who are by descent Pashtuns. So, yeah, that's
No, I mean it's
sort of a
interesting.
definition. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, from what I got mainly from that is how complex it really is, and how over time and different sort of political scenarios have led to different manifestations of the identity, whether that be ethnic or nationalistic, and both of them combined and both of them separated, obviously has to do with the narrative that you perceive to identify with the most, I assume.
Yeah.
Um, Now, a lot of that has to do with a touchy topic, I would say. It's not a topic that I know much about myself, but it is something that I would love to learn from about you, especially during this series. And it's to do with the Durand Line. Now, the Durand Line, if you could, explain, first of all, how it came about and what sort of transpired in the early days as to and why, I mean, and later on hopefully we can discuss as to why it's become such a contentious topic.
Um, well, many of our problems in today's world are colonial legacy. And Durand Line is also one of such controversial or a legacy of the British colonial rule that they have left to British. When they left British India, what they did was that they left a kind of a conflict for many people as they did in other places. But let me give you to begin with the historical perspective of the political events that took place from the early part of the 19th century till 1893, the year in which Durrani Line agreement itself was signed between Afghanistan and British India. So about let's early start of the 19th century, the Durrani state, Afghanistan, was quite spread over into British India till Punjab. Durrani had rule also they were ruling Kashmir, they were ruling provinces of Sindh, and there were also Multan was also under their rule. So it was quite well spread over empire of Afghanistan, or let's say Durrani Empire of that time. But by the start of the 19th century, what happened was that there were power struggle within the Afghan rulers themselves, the clan that ruler that time, Shah Mahmud and Shah Shuja, the Barakzais and Sadozay clan. So there was a power struggle, and this power struggle was bloody in its nature, as it has always been. And it was spread well over many decades. So what has happened that the result was that Durrani state itself started to weaken. And with this weakening, what happened was that they started to lose territory. And itself, what happened was that Kashmir was lost to the Sikhs. Sikhs also came over to the Derejat area. They also took over Peshawar. Multan was lost to the Sikhs themselves. So as a result of that political struggle for power that was taking place in that time, other powers in the region was eating up on Durrani state itself. And that was also the time when British was also expanding their rule within British India themselves. And if I could just name Shah Shuja, this is the grand son of Ahmad Shah Durrani, and he was ruling Afghanistan. Afghanistan was not like a single state later on, but before that it was, of course, the Durrani state, and he was pretty well control of all of that. But in 1809, what happened was that the British sent one of their emissary, one of their mission to Shah Shuja, who came down to Peshawar and signed a treaty with him. And this treaty was that they got into a defense alliance against a Franco-Persian invasion of British India and Afghanistan itself. So this was the first time when the British got into alliance with the Afghan ruler. But as soon as that treaty was signed and Shah Shuja was returning to Kabul, things were taking a different turn back in the capital, and there were other power people who, Dost Muhammad Khan was the Barakzai clan, and Fateh Muhammad Khan, and these were the people who were trying to take the throne of the Kabul themselves. So as a result of that struggle, 3-4 decades fast forward, what happened was that not only Durrani state lost territory to other powers in the region, but also Afghanistan itself was left divided among different principalities, 4 or 5 different principalities in that time, and each principality was controlled by a different brother of that ruling clan. Shah Shuja had to seek asylum somewhere else, so he went to first Kashmir, and then he was with Ranjit Singh in Lahore, and then ultimately he arrived at Ludhiana with the British, where he was a pensioner there, and the British supported him, or kind of kept him on pension for some time, and they thought that maybe in future he would be useful for us if we needed to exert our influence in Afghanistan at some point in time later, and that happened. So what happened was that the Sikhs, the British, and Shah Shuja, they signed a tripartite treaty, and the purpose of this treaty was that Shah Shuja would go back and take the throne with the help of these two other powers. In exchange, he was to relinquish claims on Peshawar and the Rajat region. And of course, this understanding also meant that the British would be also exercising some of their um, influence, mostly economic, in that in that time. So, and there was then two, three attempts with a difference of 4 or 5 years. So first it was in 1837, 1834, when Shah Shuja went to Kandahar and tried to regain control there, but was defeated and came back. And then there was another attempt in 1839 together, which also we call it as the First Anglo-Afghan War.
Right.
And exactly. So, I mean, by the second time they were successful in, successful in at least dethroning Dost Muhammad Khan and exiling him again in British India for some years. But as we know it, that installation of Shah Shuja Mulk on the throne of Kabul was not a successful endeavor for some time. It was just a matter of few months or year, and then there was a rebellion. And as a result of that rebellion, what happened was that about 10 to 14,000 of British forces they were defeated, and they were almost all of them were killed. It's a quite historic war of that time, when the numerically and also by weapons, and also they were not that much superior as the Afghans. The only thing they had was they were armed with the spirit of independence, as Afghans are known to be. So they rebelled, and they were the son of Dost Muhammad Khan. He was able, Prince Akbar, he was able to gain control of the Kabul itself, and the British had to retreat to Peshawar, and for some time there was no communication or some exchange between the Afghan Dost Muhammad Khan and the British. But then when the British started to take control from the Sikhs themselves, so they started to take control of the Peshawar city themselves. What happened was that during that time, there was, like this Afghanistan is like any other place, there was this war on the border. So they also had issues with the Persia. And the Persians always wanted to have the city of Herat for themselves. And this is one reason Dost Muhammad Khan, who was first exiled by the British, but then they had to allow him to return to the throne because they were defeated in the First Anglo-Afghan War. And for Dost Muhammad Khan, it was quite imperative. He never imagined in Afghanistan without Herat, and he wanted Herat in Afghanistan for any price. And the price that he chose to pay was to actually agree with the British to relinquish his claim on Peshawar. And from that point onward, I mean, I think it was in 1854 that Dost Muhammad Khan sent his son, Ghulam Haider Khan, to Peshawar to speak to the British and try to strike, try to get into a kind of agreement with them, so that they help him restore Herat from the Persians to Afghanistan. And the British agreed to it. Dost Muhammad Khan itself came again to city of Peshawar in 1857, and that was the time that the British kind of recruited him or win him over permanently, and they got into a friendly alliance forever from that point onwards. And when Dost Muhammad Khan told them that he needed to get Herat back into Afghanistan. And that was also the time when British had issues with the Persians themselves. A British mission or British ambassador in Persia itself, he was kind of mistreated or dishonored in Iran. And this was also a kind of excuse coupled together by the British, and they actually attacked Persia. And that was the point when Herat were restored also to Afghanistan, to Dost Muhammad Khan. So what they did was that the Persians signed a treaty with the British in Paris in 1857, March 1857. And the content of that treaty or the articles of the treaty were along the lines that Herat would be restored to Afghanistan, the British ambassador is going to return to Persia, and that the Persians are going to apologize to him, and in the future that the Persians would seek the consultation, would consult the British before getting into any kind of if there is any issue with the Afghans. So the Persians were supposed to first consult with the British, and that was the reason that the borders of Afghanistan was first, when the British were involved in it. It was the first. The reason was, the motivation was because the Persians sought the British help
Right.
in setting and setting in settling up a dispute between Afghanistan and Persia itself. It was the Sistan province, which Afghans also laid claim to, and the Persians also laid claim to, and this dispute went on for years. So I think the first time it was mentioned to the British by the Afghan rulers, it was Sher Ali Khan, who came to the throne in 1863 the second time, and he sought help with the British, and then the Persians also asked the British to help them settle that dispute. And this was the time that the Persians asked, because both of them needed weapons from the British to fight off and to settle that dispute. And both parties went to the British, and the British initially excused that they were not ready to interfere in settling any border dispute for these two countries, and they are free to settle that for themselves. But then in 1872, British actually appointed a border mission in Sistan, and it continued to work there. And then they kind of drew a borderline there along the natural markers, along the Helmand River and the lake where this river was poured into. So
So it
this
was
was the first time.
primarily, sorry, it was primarily like the natural, consistent, like the terrain and everything that determined what the border would look like, and nothing more than that.
Initially, it was just the terrain.
Okay.
The river itself and the lake that this river would go and flow into. I mean, you mentioned it. It's interesting. What happened was, I mean, this border dispute was settled in 1872.
Right.
What happened was that, uh, rivers evolve. They change their bed. So what happened is that by 1905, the river has changed his bed from one place to another, and also the lake has kind of disappeared, not disappeared, but changed its size and its location itself, and that was again a kind of a cause of a dispute between the two. So what happened was that both of Persians and Afghans contacted the British again in 1905, and they again set up a second mission, boundary mission, and they worked there, and again this border was settled for them.
Right.
So, I mean, involving British to draw borders for Afghanistan was something that started with the confrontation of the Persians and the Afghans themselves. But we know that with the great game in that region that was taking place between the Tsar Russia and the British
Right.
Empire themselves. So, I mean, this was also a big factor because Russians were also expanding and taking control of the territories and eating up on countries in the Central Asia. And the two superpowers also did not want to share borders. So it was a kind of agreement between both of these superpowers to treat Afghanistan as a buffer state. But what would be the limits of these buffer states? It was undefined. So what happened is that the Russians and the British in 1872, the same year when the British were settling the border between Persia and Afghanistan, the Russians were the Russians and the British, they were already talking and they had agreed in principle in deciding the limits of their influence within Afghanistan. And this was signed, this initial agreement. I mean, there were proposals by the British and there would be counter proposals by the Russians. And this thing kept on for decades. And what we know, I mean, the topic of the discussion was Durand Line, and Durand Line was actually a byproduct of all these negotiations that were going on between the Russians and the British themselves. So, I mean, the day when Durand Line agreement was signed, the same day another agreement was signed between Afghanistan and British India. And this second agreement, I mean, not many people talk about it or know about it, but it was actually the primary objective of the British mission that went to Afghanistan. So
And
what?
what was that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so
Yeah.
I mean, if you allow me, I would just explain it quickly. I mean, Russians and British had agreed in principle in defining their limits of influence, and the Russians would lay claim to, I mean, there is Oxus River, and in 1869 they started to talk. By 1872 they concluded an agreement, and in 1884, the first time, there was a boundary commission which had members from Russia and from the British, and they spent years into the field to erect markers for the border. And this kept on, but there were, of course, they also used some natural terrain and some markers from that region, but there was not insufficient information available when they were agreeing in principle what their limit of influence would be. But when they actually got on the ground, and then there was claims by Afghans, counter claims by the Russians, and so there was not an agreement for quite a long time. And initially, when these negotiations started, Afghans were not party to all of these negotiations. British were actually talking to the Russians on their behalf. So what happened that by 1893, there have been numerous agreements and proposals and party signatures on various documents deciding border, the stretch of the border from one place to another place. And at the end, what happened was that the Russians told the British that they wanted, in principle, to comply. They wanted the British to comply to the same agreement that they had signed in 1872, and they don't want to move from that position. And the British thought that it is important to send a mission to Amir Abdur Rahman and explain to him the whole situation, what would happen when we comply to that agreement that we cannot now get out of. And the reason the British mission went, which was led by Mortimer Durand, he actually sent a letter to Amir Abdur Rahman on 11th of November, appreciating his friendliness and his trust in this mission and the British, And also, then the next day, he signed two agreements. So the first agreement that he signed was actually that the Amir would respect what the British are going to decide with the Russians on the Oxus River, which actually meant that the Afghan were going to vacate some parts from the on the south of the Oxus and would get some other areas in exchange for that from the Russians. So that was the primary objective because it was a Afghanistan was stuck between two monsters, and it had not much power to have a good say in all that matter. So all Amir Abdurrahman could do was, of course, to agree to what the British were dictating to him. Um, so yeah, I mean the whole context is that it's something the colonial powers and the Russia they imposed the borders on Afghanistan, what we know today is. So none of the border that Afghanistan, what looks like today, is something that Afghanistan themselves decided. It's something that it was decided for them. And there's not much that Afghanistan or Pakistan can do about it now. But yes, it's something that was settled during that time.
Right. Okay. Well, which is very interesting because I feel like the legacy of that still lives on today. It obviously impacts the way that the politics of the region has taken place over the last century or so. I mean, if there are key moments that you could define of when that impact was the most detrimental to both, I mean, I wouldn't say well, to the people on the ground, the ones that are living around, and how much of the Durand line is, I would say, legitimized by the people on the ground as well, because I hear sometimes that it's a very porous border in some parts of both, Afghanistan and Pakistan.
hmm So the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, or some people actually, or some of the Afghan people also object when we refer to the border as border. They say they call it line and not a border.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So, but they also agree that it's something that is a border internationally. It's accepted by international law. Nowhere has Afghanistan ever challenged the legitimacy of the border itself. So, I mean, Pakistan came to the whole um, equation quite later when in 1893, when the Durand Agreement was signed. I mean, I think I forgot to. There are so many details. I mean, if we would have
Of
to talk
course.
about it, it would have to be like multi
I'm sure it's
episode
important. Yeah.
series. Yes, exactly. But I mean, when Dost Muhammad Khan in 1855 and 1856, when he was talking to the British, he also called people from the tribal region, what is now today is the Pakhtunkhwa of Pakistan, and explained to them what he was going to do and the kind of agreement he was signing with the British, which itself, as I explained, that he agreed to to relinquish his claim on Peshawar itself, on
Mm.
the region of the Pakhtunkhwa, which were occupied or were in control of the Sikhs and then by the British. So yes, I mean it's like a 2000 about 2,600 kilometer, little more border, and it's mostly based on natural terrain. So it's you would see it. It's mostly runs through the the summits of the mountains of Hindu Kush and Khoisan range, and it's in quite few places. It's the river that marks the border, the water that flows between the valleys there, and there are of course many points where there are plain border crossing between Afghanistan and Pakistan. But for the significant major part, Durand Line is defined by the natural barriers, and it's something what is consistent with how the Indians wanted it to be, because by their narrative, by their thinking, by their how they interpret history, they say that whenever India was attacked, were taken over So the invaders who came through land came through these regions. So
Right.
it was really it was to stop further invasions from these countries and in regions. Then the Hindu Kush Mountains, this natural terrain, would be the best place to define our border limits to, where we can go and defend if there are any attacks. And it's the same thing which the British also adopted. So the British always thought that the Russians would attack one day or another day. So they had their preparations there. And they also thought that to defend British India, the best place would be on these natural terrain, Hindu Kush Mountains, this area which is inhabited by Pashtuns tribesmen. Um, so yeah, what happened after Durand Line agreement was signed? The immediate aftermath was that there was a genocide of a ethnicity and of a religious minority that no one remembers today or talk about it. Today it's always about Pashtuns, but when the Durand Line Agreement was signed, there was a genocide which was supported by the British, and which was carried out by the Afghans themselves. And what they did was that they invaded a country, a region, a mountainous region, a few valleys, which used to be called as Kafiristan. And today, this region is known as Nuristan. So, I mean, the British were paying Amir Abdur Rahman about 1.2 million rupees as subsidies by 1883. After they signed the Durand Line Agreement, and when the British wanted Afghanistan to serve as a buffer between the Russian Empire and the British Empire, that also meant to the north that the Afghanistan needs to have this Wakhan territory and also Nuristan. And then Afghan Amir actually invaded that country in winters in 1896. And the invasion lasted for about more than a month, 40 days or something. And what they did was that they displaced all of the population and forced them to convert to Islam. And when the Afghan army returned from Nuristan, from Kafiristan, they also brought so many of their religious idols with them, the different symbols of their religion, because the whole of the region was forcibly converted to Islam. Those who were not converted, they were taken as slaves. So, and this is something for which the British paid Amir Abdurrahman not only in cash, they additionally paid him 50,000 rupees as subsidy in addition to what he was already getting, so that Afghanistan could completely serve as a buffer between the Russian and the British Empire. And the price was that there was this religious and ethnic minority, which is completely wiped out now. That area is called Nuristan because it was the religion of Islam was forced upon them. And previously they would be called Kafiristan, infidels, and now this area is called
So literally kafir, like,
exactly,
right,
literally
okay.
Kafir, yeah. And I
So
mean,
what do they call themselves then? If Kafiristan, I'm assuming, was the word that they used to, like the Afghans used to refer to that area. But
yeah, I
is
mean,
there,
like there have been about from there are some studies when the Temur Lane also went to that area and actually uh, wrote one of inscription there that he invaded that country that time, and he also called them infidels. Um, when Amir Abdurrahman went there, he also made sure that his inscription of his invasion is also recorded on the stone there. So these people, like they a form of Hinduism. They
right?
worship idols, kind of a animistic orientation. And what they also had their cousins in the Pakistani side of the Durand Line, the Kalasha people,
Oh, okay,
an
all
extension of
right. Okay.
the Chitral
Yeah.
region. So, I mean, what the Kalasha people get to keep their faith and their culture, is they were then under the British control, but the Kafiristan people itself, they lost their identity and their ethnicity and their religion as a result of the Durand Line Agreement. And we actually forgot to. So many people talk about Pashtuns, but nobody mentions the price, the cost of the Durand Line that the Kafiristan people themselves had to pay for it. I mean, there are also reasons why Amir Abdul Rahman in his book himself writes why he wanted to invade Kafiristan. So he lists actually different reasons, and none of those reasons point to the fact that these people are non-Muslims and they need to be brought to quotation marks light, to the light of Islam.
Mm.
But all of the reasons that he mentions, they are political. And he mentions that these people are fine warriors, and if Russia would lay claim to them, to their area, then these people can be used against me in times of war, and then I would not be able to defend myself in times of war against these people. They are very fine warriors. He also mentions that these people are actually the owners of some of the land in mainland Afghanistan. And if Russians would come there, and then when they would be empowered and encouraged to claim back what they used to hold in
Mm.
Afghanistan, and this would be a difficult situation for the Amir itself. So many reasons, all of them are political. None of them were like a religious jihad carried out against them. It was they were Islamized, but not because of that Amir Abdurrahman was any preacher of the religion and he wanted to introduce people to Islam, but because he wanted to consolidate his authority and his control over state of Afghanistan, and he was helped by the British monetarily and through other resources, ammunitions and weapons included. So when Amir Abdurrahman was taking out his invasion, almost similar situation was happening on the British side of the Durand Line. So the British had in 1895, they went to Chitral and
Mm.
installed Mehtar of Chitral of their choice. But in Swat and Dir and in Mamand and Bajawar and Khyber and Khurram and Waziristan. So these are all the tribal belt, the
Yeah.
tribal region inhabited by Pashtuns. So most of these people, they rose in revolt against the British because they did not want the British to rule them and to interfere with their tribal way of life and to interfere with their religious way of life. And they fought quite a bloody and brave war against the British Indian Empire, and also paid huge sacrifices. It's also mostly forgotten. Not many people talk about it, but this war lasted for about an year, less than a year.
What
And
years are we talking about now?
we are talking about 1897, so this would
Okay,
be
all
like
right.
about 4 years after the Durand Line.
Right, okay, all right.
And when this was happening, I mean, it was not that all of this region was fighting as a single force against the British authority, but
Mm.
different isolated individual rebellions were taking place. Of course, there were leaders who were trying to unite all of these forces against the British,
Right.
and many of them were successful, by the way. I mean, the British had to issue an appeal to the Indian Maharajas to help them with resources and with manpower and with soldiers. And some of the Punjabi Maharajas, Singhs, they actually came down themselves with their own armies and with their own resources. And with the British weaponry, they carried out a huge operation, a huge war against the Pashtuns in all of these different regions that I've just named earlier. And this is not much talked about, but this was as big as the mutiny of 1857 itself, except for the fact that this was a war of independence for the Indians against the British, but this was war of independence of the Pashtuns against the British.
Right.
And I mean, there are no exact numbers now, but what I've read, the numbers of Pashtuns who died fighting that war for their independence could well be between 30 to 50,000 people at minimum.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, and when this was happening, I mean, just if I give you a quick example of one region, Khyber, the Afridis, the Shinwaris, they were able to actually um, win over all of the region that they were there. The British had to flee. They gave up on that region and they all came back to Peshawar. And this was the time that they sent their emissaries, their leaders, to Afghanistan, and they pleaded with the Amir Abdur Rahman, who had signed a treaty, an agreement with the British earlier, and they pleaded with him that this is a jihad, and we don't want to be ruled by the British, and we need your assistance. Since you are the authority of Muslim authority who can declare jihad, you can do that for us and also assist it. But Amir Abdur Rahman refused to meet them. And he also issued a public notice that it is incumbent on all Muslims to respect their promises. And since I've made a promise with the British, through which I've relinquished you guys and the region of the Pashtun, so I do not want to break my promise. And I'm not breaking my promise because it's something which the Quran and the Allah tells us that never break your promises. And Durand Line is a promise that I've made as a Muslim monarch, so I don't want to break that promise. So I mean, this war of 1897 and also 1898, that was fought quite heavily by the Pashtuns, but there was no way the Pashtuns could win that war because Afghanistan was not there to help, and of course with the British and Indian forces outnumbering them in every way, they had. But I mean, even though the war was not won, but the British were never successful in subjugating them till 1947 when they left India. So I mean, there has never been a single year where Pashtuns have not resisted the British colonial rule themselves.
Which is very interesting. And I mean, because I'm wary of the time, I would like to bring this discussion further to the present day.
Okay.
And so, you know, the Durrani Line today and the way that it acts on the ground at the moment and how people perceive it at the moment on, you know, and there's also one other very, you know, I mean, I think I would like obviously the academic side, but also from your personal experiences as well. You hear a lot about Afghan refugees within Pakistan and the way that they're treated.
Yeah.
You know, can you give your comments on that, please?
Yeah, sure. When I've myself grown up in Khyber, in Landikota, and I've been to Afghanistan many a times without any passport or any identity card myself. I have taught in a school where most of my students were Afghan and they would cross the border into Pakistan. And the school was like just 1 kilometer into Pakistan, and they would come and we would teach them there. And also in Waziristan, and there is one Uluswali or district on the Afghan side with a population of about 80,000 or something. 40,000 of them got Pakistani identity cards, and they would come to Pakistan. They would send their children to Pakistan for education. I've never heard any of the Pashtun leader on my side, on the Pakistani side, that they have ever called Afghans refugees. They've always called Afghans brothers. And they would say that you are not refugee here, you are in your brother's place, you are at your brother's house, you are at your brother's home. And this is something that all of Pakistani political leadership always said it loud, whether it was military dictator or whether it was politicians appointed to the prime minister house. So Afghans uh, have always been welcomed. However, it would also be incorrect to assume that everything was exactly like between the Ansar and the Mahajirin. So it was not like that. There have been Afghans. They've been mistreated. I mean, this is going to be then a whole new discussion. Pashtuns themselves have been victims of stereotyping, and there have been this demonization of them through decades, starting from the Persian and British times, that Pashtuns have been demonized and stereotyped, and they've been demeaned and they've been looked down upon. So Pashtuns in generally and Afghan refugees themselves, of course, they've been instances of mistreatment. There've been instances where, I mean, I went to school and almost 30-40% of my class fellows were Afghans, and they had no documents of being a refugee or being a Pakistani, but it was quite possible for them to go through and go to school and have the education. But this is not true what we can say today. For today, it's not true. So many of Afghans, they've been harassed by the police. They are required to carry certain documents. They are required, or maybe they are not allowed to get into certain jobs. They are not allowed to get into certain positions. They are not allowed to go to certain education institutions themselves. I mean, if Pakistan was really interested in treating the Afghan refugees, Pakistan must have already granted the children of these refugees who have been living in Pakistan for over 3-4 decades citizenship rights. I mean, they are born in Pakistan, and by Pakistani constitutions, they are entitled to Pakistani citizenship. But this is not something, a right extended to them. And of course, I mean, we can talk about the visa regime. We can talk about the Afghan transit trade. There is so much Pakistan claims and portrays that Pakistan is doing, but there is so much room for improvement. There is so much more to be done to actually to allow Afghans to be to benefit from all these procedures themselves. So, in my understanding, Afghan refugees, a big majority of them have lived with their Pashtun brothers and their villages and their lands, and but yes, there is also quite a big number of them who've been mistreated and continue to be mistreated. And with the recent politics going on with the PTM and stuff, this has also kind of played against the Afghans foremost. I mean, because they identify themselves to be Afghans, and there are Pakistani nationalists who then they say, if you are Afghan refugees, you have no right to take part in the PTM politics or the politics PTM is trying to play. So yes, I think our Afghans, there are things that Pakistan needs to improve upon, definitely. And as per my understanding, neither Pakistan nor Afghanistan can ever prosper if we are not friendly and brotherly to each other. And I mean, like there are, Pakistan has fenced the border. So what they have done is that this is quite a long border, stretch of a border, 2,600 kilometers, but they have fenced this off, most of it. And I'm not happy about it, because walls and forced borders have never worked. I mean, it's an exercise that Pakistan can benefit from it at the moment because of this war on terror and some elements which are in Afghanistan, and they try to infiltrate into Pakistan. So this is something advantageous for this time. But in the long run, I do not think that enforced borders like this, which divides communities in some regions, would ever be accepted. I think this is something that Pakistan should reconsider, and Afghanistan also should play their part. I mean, there is so much responsibility on the politicians and the public itself that we need to be more friendlier to each other. That I always say that the best way to get rid of the Durand Line is that to turn into a zone of cooperation in economics. I mean, as long as the people are freely moving and they are benefiting from the trade, there would be not as many conflicts as we see today.
Well, I mean, we can only hope. And, I do think discussions like this are very useful in the, historical understanding and how they've been used to pit two, I mean, you can say two peoples, but people amongst themselves, against each other. And it's quite heartbreaking sometimes when you see nationalistic ideology play out. And quite recently it's been playing out in our cricket matches too. So, it's taking place on all fronts. And it can be heartbreaking when you're neighbors with some, a nation state at the very least. And putting brother against brother essentially, so
Yeah.
it can be so no, but that's a very wholesome note to, I think, end on, unless, if there are any concluding remarks that you would like to make before we do finish, because our time is almost up.
I think there is so much more to say, to add to the whole topic, but to conclude with, I conclude with the prayers that Pakistan and Afghanistan and the people who are in positions of power, who can do something about sorting out the issues that both countries face with, they have a responsibility. I mean, this is something. This conflict has been going on for decades. I mean, Pakistan, when the Afghan jihad against Russian occupation started, Pakistan itself kind of just said, well, there's no Durand Line or border at all. Afghan Mujahideen can just stay here and they can equip themselves, take their weapons, and go and attack the Russians there. And now they said that, well, if this conflict can also happen in the reverse direction, then we better fence ourselves, fence the borders. But I think this is something which would not help neither Pakistan, nor the people of Pakistan, nor the people of Afghanistan, if we would have strict borders like that. This we should evolve, we should look forward, and we should try to achieve the kind of economic operations the Europeans have achieved. There have been more feud between the European nations, the Germans and the French, than the Pashtuns and the Afghans or the Pakistani Muslims or against the Afghans. So I think there is definitely room that we can try to go and to fix those issues. Yes, I mean, I will continue, and I'm sure there are many people who think on the same lines. They think that Afghans and Pakistanis should not confront each other. Rather, they should cooperate on so many matters that where we can really develop a complementary relationship.
I do hope so. For the sake of the people that are losing their lives, at least on the ground, and have, the innocent lives that are involved in all of this. Dr. Rehman, thank you so much for joining us and giving us such historical insight. And it was very interesting to listen to. I would also like to thank our audience for watching. Please join us again on the coming Wednesday at the same time, where we'll be in conversation with award-winning photographer Massoud Hosseini. And I would like to thank everyone again, based from Identity International.
Thank you very much.